Discernment is the ability to recognize that something is going to happen before it happens. It is the application of pattern recognition with inferencing and filling in the blanks to come up with the best guess, probabilistic outcome that, given all of the data points and the person or the situation in question, that it has a great likelihood of coming into fruition. It allows you to gracefully exit before it blows up in your face. It allows you to break up before you get to the nightmare. And yet, given its importance, we don't talk about it very much in mainstream society. In the spiritual and metaphysical communities, yes, because we understand how important it is. Especially when we start going through the dark night of the soul, shadow work journey, we have lessons of discernment. We're often brought situations, so we have a chance to practice and to get it wrong. But in mainstream culture, in high school, for example, you don't hear people emphasizing the need for discernment. When it comes to fake news or even mainstream news, discernment is not encouraged. It's not taught. There are critical thinking skills that can be taught, particularly at some high school curricula and also in college, liberal arts colleges especially, where you learn how to dissect, how to look at data and draw conclusions, and how to use critical thinking skills. But this is not mandatory. At least it wasn't when I was getting my education. It's not mandatory across all school systems. And it's also not mandatory for people at work. Even though, as a manager, you need to be discerning. As a leader, a boss, an employee, where you work, the jobs you take, the ones you don't. Are you getting into a toxic situation or not? Can you read that from the interview alone? Or are you in such a desperate position that you have to take whatever comes to you, regardless? So what happens is that we go through life hearing things like judgment is wrong, and to open our hearts, to be forgiving and loving and kind and compassionate. And this idea of unconditional love sort of bred into us, culturally speaking, where for many people, especially if they are in any sort of religious pursuits or activities, or even metaphysical ones, there's this idealized notion that we should lead the way in love because that's all we are. Everything else is just an expression of the shadow or the lower sentient, or as AI ChatGPT recently reworded that for me, lower dimensional urges, which I think I might prefer because lower sentience has a connotation that rubs people the wrong way. So when we are evolving in our modern day world and we're indoctrinated and reinforced with this idea that turning the cheek, loving people, endlessly, compassionately, with understanding and embodying traits like Christ consciousness or the beautiful nature of wise ascended masters that have come before us, like Buddhas. It creates this image in our minds, which cause us to disconnect from our critical thinking skills, from our logical mind, from our pattern recognition that wants to question and probe and to think about things and dissect and to ask, does this make sense? Or where is this really going? Where are we going? And when we collectively hear messages like judgment is bad, it's an oversimplification, but that's what's ingrained in us. So we subconsciously want to disconnect and repress anything that we perceive might be judgment. And we're not trained or encouraged necessarily, except in some small outpost here and there, to use discernment. Then obviously, collectively speaking, we can understand when we find ourselves in situations where our discernment is tested. And what this looks like practically is that we will have challenges and opportunities to demonstrate that we understand where things are going before it happens. And we course correct. I mean, that's ultimately the point of discernment, is to apply action in advance of something happening. And if you don't do that, you can still discern, but it's not very powerful as when you can use it like a clairvoyant ability, but without the woo-woo or the psychic part of it, using your rational mind to make a best guess of what is unfolding before it happens, so you can hit the exit button, or so you can solve it before it actually occurs. The right solution is not always leaving. Sometimes it's actually looking something dead on, confronting it with all of your might and conviction and wherewithal, and blowing the wind out of it. Sometimes all it takes is being there right on time before it goes in a direction where it cannot be tamed or checked. It's almost like you show up to second base right when you need to, split second, can change the entire game. And the tricky part of using discernment, especially if you are transparent and honest with people, is that those that discernment is being applied against often aren't happy about it, because more times than not, they're in their shadow patterns, or they're just trying to get something that they desire, an outcome. And the way in which they're going about it is questionable or unethical, in your opinion, or is violating some boundary that you have or would like to set. And so as a result, you confront them, or you say no because you see what is starting to play out. And this is where more discernment is needed, particularly if you are very sensitive and empathetic towards those that you care about. those that you're connected to. Because when people are in their shadow unconscious, they might even be unaware of it, what they're doing, what you're discerning. And even those that are aware of it are not always forthcoming and honest, especially when it might paint them in a negative light. Not everybody's like this, but those who are in their shadow are typically those that you need to apply discernment to, right? And so, very often, those people are very resistant and reluctant to things like accountability, responsibility, and the accurate application of discernment against them, especially when they are trying to get something that they want, an outcome. And this is where I believe that many people are challenged to be strong in their self-trust. Because when you know, you know. And sometimes there's a little bit of discernment that relies on intuition, meaning you're kind of looking into the dark. You don't really have a flashlight, but you kind of have really great night vision. But there's still a part of you that can allow yourself to second guess. Say, well, maybe I should just wait till I can find a flashlight before I make a judgment call. Maybe we should call it a discernment call. And in doing so, you might actually lose the power of discernment, which is to get an early read on something. And that's when I would say it's best to use your guiding compass, which includes intuition, but other factors as well, to really understand the risk involved. And you might be a cautious type, for example, and just lean that way naturally. You might not need to get the flashlight to double check, but you might have a hard time with this particular situation, whatever it is for you, making that call because perhaps you really don't want to believe that things are unfolding in that direction. I've certainly been down that road. And so as a result, it can create a lot of resistance and wanting to sort of gaslight yourself or to doubt yourself and say, maybe it's me. Maybe I'm just reading too much into things. Maybe you are. Maybe there's a reason that you're there. And this is part of your soul's path. And so thinking of your purpose, the direction, your highest self, most optimal timeline is this position right here. And the decision that you make going to lead you to that highest outcome. If your decision is right, how will that change it? If your decision is wrong, how will that change it? And that's how you can sort of play with it and understand, okay, I'm here in space-time. At my feet, I have 3 different timelines that are converging right on my toes. All I have to do is take a step in one direction. Where am I going? And how will this decision impact where I'm going? And if I don't decide, is somebody deciding for me and is sending me in a direction that I didn't necessarily choose? This is what I feel the collective is facing. That when we are unawake to certain patterns or trends that are playing out, or, God forbid, we just delude ourselves into thinking that there is no pattern, and then it's all just random chaos. Okay, I clearly have an opinion. You don't have to join me in that opinion. But when we allow for others to create our reality for us and to decide for us, it's like standing at that point in space and time on those three timelines. Somebody's just shoving us into one of the timelines. That's when we are chewing over things or just remaining asleep to it, completely unaware or in deep, deep denial. And imagine for a moment that the year, actually, it's a time window, the years 2025 to 2027. Perhaps for some of the stragglers, 2029. Perhaps that this is that juncture where the timelines are going to really split. And with that awareness of discernment being our collective karmic lesson, imagine that we are shaken so badly awake, viciously even, that it forces us to examine the nature of truth and reality and how we could have missed things, which is ultimately helping us to learn discernment. Almost as though the lessons get more and more painful until we finally get it. Just like in our personal lives, when you have to learn intuition, you will be faced with people who take from you, who betray you, who want to perhaps harm you in some significant way, sabotage you, who are so deep in their shadow that they can't help but to turn into somebody else under just the right conditions. I've seen it. It's like a random full blood moon and the person turns into a werewolf. So imagine that when you are learning intuition and discernment, that the universe, in fact, brings you situations and people to give you those learning opportunities. But then imagine, too, that because of where you were raised and place in time, that you don't necessarily understand that that's what's happening. And instead, you're blithely moving forward through life, saying, it's not that big of a deal. Yeah, I know, it's a little weird. Where did the moon go? What's happening with the sun? What's going on out there? I don't know. It's just weird. What's happening with our fill in the blank and fill in the blank? And all of these pieces are adding up that something about the stories in which we have been told are not true. And imagine that you start to realize this at the exact split second that allows you to slide to second base just the right amount of time. Instead of walking or running all the way there, you realize I have to do something a little different with my momentum and go in a slightly different trajectory or direction. That is the power of discernment, allowing you the ability to move in a direction that would be favorable for you before something like a nightmare really begins. And before I close, I'd like to leave you with an unanswered question that I have. I haven't figured it out yet. I watched an interview with Mark Andreessen, venture capitalist who apparently had a meeting with people in DC. He doesn't say who the people were, at least in this clip, but he said something horrified him. And that was that he was advised by some higher ups not to invest in AI startups because those were essentially going to be controlled and dominated by 2 or 3 major corporations and locked down. The technology was going to be locked down. And Mark was kind of stunned, like, well, how are you going to do this? And apparently the people who were advising him said, well, we'll suppress the math if we need to. And Mark was like, well, how can you suppress the math that's already out there? And they apparently said, well, during the Cold War, we suppressed entire branches of physics and math. And this coincides with Dr. Greer's work, indicating that there are aspects, science and technology, that have been hidden out of mainstream view for a while. And those in the mainstream that try to say that this exists are laughed at and mocked as people hold tight to the dogma that all science and technology which exist is known. What do you think about AI being controlled by 2 or 3 major corporations and governments? Do you believe that transparency and accountability is important, particularly with such a powerful and influential technology? It's a game changer. It's the next revolution. How do we use our discernment to understand what's really happening here before a nightmare begins? More importantly, what action do we take to ensure that nightmare doesn't come?